All right, it's 101. Let's get started and welcome everyone to session 2 of the 3-part workshop using ACPF outputs in watershed planning and implementation. I am Marcel Lewandowski with the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, and Kevin Erb from the University of Wisconsin is on tech support today. So jot down his email address in case you need to get a hold of somebody outside of Zoom. Our agenda today, we're going to start and take a few minutes to review what we talked about on Monday, answer questions and so on. And then we will move into a panel of people who have used ACPF for quite a while and just hear what their experiences have been, what the value has been, what the challenges have been. So as we get started with a little bit of review, I want to just get a feel for the room, where people are at. Based on our discussion on Monday, how do you feel about your understanding of what you heard on Monday? So do you understand what information you can get out of ACPF, just in a basic level? And if you could just type into the chat kind of a yes or no, not really, or it's completely not beyond me. So basically the question is, what do you understand what you can get out of the ACPF outputs?
And if everybody says yes, we know some people are lying. So please be honest.
Better. I think so. Yeah, that's a good answer. And then my second question for you is, which ACPF output are you most interested in?
And maybe Marcel quickly review what those are for folks.
The outputs can be any of the pieces of information that ACPF can produce. So that can be risk, runoff risk map, or maybe it's the locations for grassed waterways, or it's the hydrology. What's the hydrology of the watershed? Lots of people noting the runoff risk, the hydromodified DEM, and that the hydrography. That's yep. And then the conservation practice locations. That's the whole point of ACPF. So that good. Well, if you haven't already found it, in your handouts is this spreadsheet I just put linked in the chat with the questions that people have sent in. So I'm going to shift over to that if I can find myself here. So this is the spreadsheet that I just linked to. There are a couple questions that came in after the session last time, and I'm going to ask Emily if she would respond to these. The first one is, how do these cut lines and dam lines work? Because that's, for somebody who's not familiar with ACPF and with digital elevation models, those can be a little confusing.
Excuse me. Yeah, thanks, Marcel. So good questions. So essentially when you're going through that last step of the DEM preparation, the process for cut lines and dam lines. For the cuts, you're looking at where you want water to flow on that digital elevation model. And a lot of times the information that you're using to understand where that water is flowing are things like the hill shade, the aerial imagery, infrastructure maps. So you can start to understand where there might be areas where the DEM needs to be hydromodified to reflect where water's flowing. And then those cut lines, essentially all you're doing is, remember, on Monday I showed that image of the grid of elevation. So where you make those cut lines, the grid cells underneath that cut line, you can think about them as essentially dropping. And so when those grid size cells drop and you sort of lower your essentially lowering the elevation there, you're going to cause water to flow along that flow path. So you're modifying the digital elevation model to allow water to flow where you want it to. The principle is similar with dams, except instead of dropping the elevation of those grid cells, you're increasing the elevation of those grid cells to reflect an impediment or impoundment of some kind. So one thing to be really, really clear about here is that the process for cut and dams, you're modifying the DEM, not modifying any sort of like flow or volume of water. It's just a modification of where that water is flowing. And I think more broadly, it's just important to remind folks that the ACPF is not estimating or quantifying the volume of water that's moving across the landscape. It's just using the digital elevation model to understand where the area, the number of grid cells where water is aggregating and then where it's flowing across the landscape. So I think that's important to point out. There are other tools that are available that do that, but ACPF isn't one of them. I'm sorry, I'm just reading that second piece there. So I think that, and then the question there has a second part about thinking about the wetland or impoundment tool. And so one point I want to make is that the wetland tool is basically just moving along an ephemeral flow path, and it's identifying these points and then creating these impoundments and then basically testing out wetlands behind those impoundments to see if they fall within the parameters of the tool. Namely thinking about the pool to buffer ratio and then the height ratios to make sure it falls within NRCS guidelines. So when that happens, that's the process. It's not at all related to the dam lines that you might be editing in the first toolbox of the tool.
Emily, there were also another component of this about what estimating the impacts of practices. And I think it's important to understand that ACPF does not estimate impacts. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that and talk about the FinArt tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So ACPF, the toolbox that you download from ACPF for watersheds.org is just it's a tool that identifies areas where there might be resource concerns and then offers it characterizes potential areas for conservation practices. The logical next questions that we often think about are basically twofold. First, how much does it cost? How much do those various scenarios cost? And then what are the environmental outcomes that are associated with putting those practices in place? There is an add-on tool called the ACPF Financial and Nutrient Reduction Tool. It's available for Iowa and Minnesota right now, and soon to be in Illinois and Indiana, and hopefully in Wisconsin as well. And essentially what that tool does is it quantifies opportunity costs, direct costs, nitrate reduction that you might estimate from those practices. And sort of like hot off the press, a postdoc who works with the ACPF National Hub just had a paper accepted that will allow ACPF FineArt to also examine sediment reduction. So, if that's of interest to you, there's a separate add-on tool that you can download from ACPF for watersheds.org. You can certainly reach out to me and I can point you in the right direction, or the ACPF support team would be able to do that as well. The last thing I'll just mention, because I think there was a water storage component here, there isn't a formal assessment of water storage, particularly related to infiltration increases. But for some of the practices like wetlands, there is quantification in the tabular data, the attribute table, about how much water you would expect to have stored both in the pool and the buffer. So for some of those impoundment-based practices, that information would be available.
Thank you, Emily. Are there other questions, things that came up after the class, on Monday? You can either unmute or type something in the chat. All right. Well, if you think of other stuff, don't hesitate to add your questions to that feedback form or to the chat. And Emily is happy to help out. Let's shift to the panel. Pull up their names here. So Dr. Joel Magner is here at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering, and has been working on hydrology in agricultural watersheds for decades, and had a project where he worked in Indiana on Beargrass Creek that he'll talk about that. Kevin Keener is with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and has been working on a very unique monitoring project in southeast Minnesota. And Sarah Cusso from Outagamie County, Wisconsin, in their Land Conservation Department, is also joining us here. So thank you, all three of you. What I wanted to start with is just go around and ask questions. I have some questions that I will ask people, but I encourage people to add their comments to the chat at any time as we're talking. But just to get us going, I'm going to go around the room, the three people, and just ask, give us an overview of the project that you're working on. Participants have had a chance to watch your videos, so you don't have to tell the whole story, but just remind us and pull out some of the key points. What's the name of the watershed? What were the maps that you used? What scale, what format, and who used them? Who built these, and who are the people that have been using them, and how did you use them? So Joe, I wonder if we could start with you and down in Beargrass Creek.
Sure. Joe Magner here. So this was a project that began probably a decade ago now. We received funding from the Environmental Defense Fund through a Conservation Innovation Grant. Our mission was to figure out how to get a 45% nutrient reduction to the Gulf of Mexico. And so at the time, Mark Tomer was still around. He wasn't retired yet. And working with the Environmental Defense Fund, we were looking at a variety of small watersheds across the upper Midwest, and settled on the Bear Creek grass watershed in Indiana because there was a small college there that had been really investing in getting to know farmers and getting them to think about different conservation practices. And so that's why we chose Beargrass, is because we didn't have to start from scratch. We could hit the ground running. And as a result, we were able then to really get some good background data. My graduate students spent several years then collecting data on the site. And then after he finished school, he was actually hired as the 319 coordinator. And he was able to spend another additional 3 years working with landowners to get practices on the ground. And so I think we accomplished more than we thought we would get done at that on that watershed.
I also have trouble with this mute thing still. Kevin, if you could tell your story down in Root River watershed.
Sure. Yeah, Kevin Keener, hydrologist with Department of Agriculture. About 15 years ago, we had the opportunity to develop a research and demonstration project in the Root River watershed, which is a large watershed located in the southeast corner of Minnesota. And our overall goal was to help kind of answer some important questions that a lot of our water quality stakeholders had regarding the effectiveness of practices and at various scales. And so what we did is we selected 3 small study watersheds, each less than about 5,000 acres in size, that represented kind of the unique landscapes that we have in that watershed, ranging from tile drained flat areas of the watershed to karst to bluffland type landscapes in that area. And so with those watersheds, we installed a lot of monitoring equipment, both at the edge of field scale and at the small watershed scale, and also groundwater networks, monitoring networks. And we kind of had this baseline period of about 8 or 9 years where we did some baseline monitoring within those small watersheds. And then we got into phase 2, which was to basically implement additional practices in those small watersheds and saturate them with as many practices as we could, really targeting what we call these critical source areas. These areas that yield a disproportionate amount of the loss, both sediment, nutrient, and pesticide loss in those watersheds. And we were fortunate around the same time that Mark and Sarah with ARS were developing these tools, and we had a chance to test them out. We mainly, used kind of an approach where we worked individually with each of those farmers in those watersheds. There's about 50 farmers. And we hired a dedicated person to go out there and do what we call these field walkovers. And that was really to get the conversation going and to utilize, the maps in the background in terms of where to focus our efforts.
Thanks, Kevin. And Sarah.
Yeah, so we've been using the ACPF in the Lower Fox River Basin in Wisconsin. So that drains to the Bay of Green Bay. There was a TMDL that was developed in 2012 with significant phosphorus and sediment reductions. So we kind of been going through the sub-watersheds by the highest loading and developing 9 key element plans. So the ACPF model is very useful in helping to cross off those different elements of, where are the critical areas, what practices are recommended, and then kind of getting like estimates for the cost of the BMPs. And then we've also had, obviously we've been applying for grants during that time for those different watersheds to actually do the implementation. So a lot of those outputs are also helpful in transferring that data to the grants to know what you're applying for. And then like our agronomists have been working with the farmers and presenting these maps. And they've been pretty much open to being like, yeah, that field does erode more than this field, or that's a bad area there. And the implementation aspect of it. And then we've also have a wastewater treatment plant up here that chose adaptive management on 2 HUC 12 subwatersheds. So they also use that ACPF data and prioritization of areas for their adaptive management plan as well.
Nice, thank you. So you all 3 of you have sort of touched on this already, but say more explicitly, what was your purpose for adding the ACPF? What did ACPF add to your projects that you weren't getting from other tools? And I don't know, I'll open it up. Who wants to speak first?
I guess I'll chime in here. I guess at the time when we were using ACPF, there really wasn't too many tools out there that were this specific in terms of, really showing you at a field scale where to really focus your efforts and, what practices might be, best suited for that area. So I think that was a huge advantage for us. And then, our main goal was to really focus on those critical source areas, and especially those areas that have concentrated flow. So, in particularly, the outputs from the stream power index, which is used to identify, locations for grass waterways, and then of course the runoff risk output from the tools were very helpful, just to help us do our homework before we start talking to these landowners. That we have kind of a better sense of what what's out there and where can we really focus our limited resources and time.
Thanks.
I can go next. So Wisconsin has the eval model, which was released, I think, just a few years prior to when I heard about the ACPF model. And the one thing that the eval model is lacking is like more of the structural practice citing. So that's what I liked about using the ACPF. It kind of just provided more outputs than what we had available to us at first. So I still run both of them when I'm doing watershed planning work, as they're both helpful that way.
Thanks. And Joe?
Yeah, unlike Kevin, the watershed in Indiana was relatively flat, and so we weren't really looking at steep slopes or trying to control sediment as much as Kevin described in southeastern Minnesota. We were far more interested in how nitrogen was working through the soil profile, and so. And given that this watershed also had subsurface tile drainage, some of the practices we were looking at here included some type of agricultural water management, putting in two-stage ditches in bioreactors to kind of reduce some of the nitrate loading. And so at the time, ACPF, even though it's not a hydrologic model per se, it did allow us to sort of look at slope and where we could kind of go in and do some retrofit with the tile drainage system to manage how much nitrate would come out the tiles. And then we could also then look at the stream system and figure out where is it possible where we could go in and build a two-stage ditch, or further downstream even look at how we could reconnect oxbows to take some of the higher nitrate water and move that into a more reduced kind of riparian wetland system to knock down some of the nitrate values coming out of the system. And so the GIS component of this tool allowed us to really sort of visually figure out, which landowner to go knock on their door and get a sense of what they'd be willing to let us try.
Thanks. I am Pete Vincent from the Michigan Eagle, environmental, the state agency, the state EPA agency, was not able to join us today. But I want to share a little bit about what they've been doing in Michigan. They've been doing these agricultural inventories at a watershed scale. And so they've taken the ACPF flow accumulation network and information on the slopes and the potential locations for some of these practices that are important. And that's one piece of their inventory. But then they do additional desktop analysis, including field boundaries, which that comes from the ACPF database. What fields are next to water bodies, which that you could get from the ACPF. I'm not sure if they did it that way. They had a map of what fields have and don't have filter strips, the cave hole manure applications, they've got that, and the livestock location. So they've got all that. They're throwing all of this into the map for each watershed. And then field inventories of how is the land being used. And from all of this information, they're combining that to identify target areas that they want to talk to the farmers and where the most important areas to go. So just showing this slide so you can see Pete Bitson and Glenn O'Neill. Those are the people who have been working on this. And if you're interested in contacting them and learning more about what they're doing with these watersheds, they've particularly focused on the Western Lake Erie Basin and have quite a few of those watersheds done. These numbers are from, I think they might even be 2 years old. So they've gotten beyond that since then. So that's what they're working on in Michigan, but I'll ask the rest of you, what type of non-ACPF information was it particularly important for you to use and link to the ACPF information? How does this fit with other data sources that you're working with?
Yeah, I guess I'll chime in here too. I guess, mapping existing BMPs was another piece that we try to do because, of course, ACPF does not, tell you that, right? It may identify an area that looks like could be a grass waterway or structure, but maybe that producer already has existing practices that help with that. So what we did is we did map out what we could best do from the desktop, just from air photo interpretation, where those practices may be. So it'd be like terraces, grass waterways, any type of structure, pond or water sediment control basin, those types of things. We would then use that to basically adjust the classification from the runoff risk output. So if you recall from that output, there's like different categories, some of them being ranging from low to critical. And so what we would do is then adjust those fields, the classifications, from let's say high to very high to maybe low, because we could tell that there was already quite a bit of conservation on that particular area of the field. So that allowed us again to continue to refine and really, hone in on those targeted areas. Obviously, you don't really know until you actually get out there and field verify some of that stuff, but it was a way for us to just, better prioritize our time. The other piece that is often, especially those organizations that maybe don't have access to this, but another piece of information that of course is critical is just who owns the land and who operates the land. And sometimes land ownership is pretty easy to get sometimes, but of course who actually operates it is another story, and that can take some time to get that information and figure out that piece of it. But so yeah.
I agree with the like having the availability of like aerial imagery, especially if it's at like 6-inch resolution, is really helpful to have when verifying the results and kind of calibrating the tools to get the results you want. Checking for those existing BMPs. Another thing that we do too at our county department is we will map nutrient management plans that farmers are required to turn into us. And that also has soil test P data. So we have also used that to kind of overlay with like the high runoff risk. So, this field may be high runoff risk, but it's not really that high in phosphorus versus this one's high runoff risk and high phosphorus. So we really want to prioritize that. So that's another one that's critical. And then that's also tracking like the operator of that field more or less too. We do have some of that information then by tracking those nutrient management plans.
Nice, thanks. Joe?
Yeah, for the Beargrass Creek watershed, I mean, we are obviously collecting a lot of data in the watershed, and so I think in some regards, what we were really trying to do is validate what some of the ACPF was suggesting. So by actually having students that were going out collecting water samples coming out of tile drains. We had installed a number of shallow wells throughout the watershed, so we understood pretty well where the nitrogen and even phosphorus concentrations were within that watershed, and could sort of validate. Okay, ACPF says here would be a good place to have a deep-rooted buffer. And we could go back and say, yeah, either you hit the nail on the head, or or somehow or another, the ACPF was not quite providing the accuracy that we'd hoped. And overall, I'd say the ACPF did a really good job that lined up with the field data that we'd gathered.
All right, let's get into the challenges. And when you were pulling your hair out, what are the pitfalls in using the ACPF that people should look out for if they're going to jump into this? And may as well keep going in the same order, Kevin, if you're willing to start.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, when we started using ACPF, it was back kind of in the early stages of development. So, fortunately, we had a kind of a dedicated student worker that helped kind of process a lot of these data sets. But we did, with some of that new development, we did have some glitches, with the software and with the hardware, or the software, I guess, piece of it, of course. But a lot of that I think has been resolved, here in the latest versions. But I think for someone that doesn't do a lot of GIS work and spends a lot of time working with it, it is one of those things where it can be a little bit daunting to get involved with it. But I think that's where I keep thinking, especially for a lot of the soil and water districts that I work with, they just don't have the time to do a lot of that pre-processing work. What they tell me is they just want the output and tell me which fields do I really need to focus on, and really boil it down to that. And so I think that's something that we're continuing to strive for, and make these tools like pre-processed, readily available for the practitioner, so they're easier to use. I also would like to see an opportunity for farmers and landowners to get access to some of this more readily, and then also contractors. And we all know there's a lot of caveats with using this information, but I think with a little bit of basic training, I think giving and empowering those people to use those different, in an easy to use way, I think would go a long way in getting the use of some of these tools. So
The ACPF hub in Iowa and other partners in Iowa have really made a lot of strides in making the data available statewide, that not just the input data, but the output data. And so Iowa is the furthest ahead of any of the states in doing that. So you'll all hear more about this on Friday, about what they're doing and how they're doing it, because it really requires an investment at a state level to try and make these outputs available, as Kevin is suggesting, to all the different people who could use it. Sarah, what about you? What are the challenges and warnings you would give people?
I think the biggest challenge is just trying to figure out when you get error messages on running the tools, what you may have done wrong for the inputs, or sometimes it was just a random thing. You just need to close out ArcMap and come back in, and it'll work fine again. And I noticed when I had moved from ArcMap to ArcPro, it's been a while since I've run it on Pro. I think it's a few versions ahead now since I last run it, but there was a lot of things too where it seemed to work fine in ArcMap, but when I went to ArcPro, that stuff didn't work. So, but I haven't run it in a while, so it could be different now. That was probably the biggest challenge.
I think in the latest updates they've fixed a lot of those glitches, so it only runs in ArcPro now, and I think that's working a lot more smoothly. And also you'll hear that there's a lot more support from the national hub in Iowa for that kind of thing, and getting through some of those glitches, and again, you'll hear more about that on Friday. Joe, how about you?
Yeah, I think the probably the biggest challenge here is that this is a GIS tool. It is not it's not a model that's programmed based on input parameters like an HSPF or a SWAT model or a soil water balance model. It's simply taking GIS information and giving you as good of information as possible. And so realizing that if you're trying to solve a total maximum daily load and you need a model, this tool is great in Minnesota, for example, in connecting with the HSPF model, and they have because HSPF doesn't provide a graphical output, uh, we can take that data from that model, use a scenario application manager coupled with ACPF, and actually then figure out, you know, what hydrologic pathway is occurring where, and then using ACPF go out and sort of identify where a particular practice can go. So it's, I think, recognizing that this is simply a GIS tool, and how to couple it then with some other tools is where we're at these days now on the cutting edge.
Thanks. So Kevin, you kind of alluded to concerns about sharing this data too much. But I'll ask all three of you, have you run into any issues and concerns about data privacy? And more generally, what are the challenges with communicating the outputs from ACPF? Or what's your advice for sharing this information?
Yeah, so in our case, with the 50 farmers that we were working with, we made it really clear to them that whatever was discussed about, the maps, and then also what we did was called the field walkover, where we had a technician go out there and inventory their farm and, document the good things that they're doing, but also document the opportunities for improvement by targeting some of these areas. We made it clear to them that, that was a discussion between them and the technician, and whether or not they wanted to move forward with getting public cost share dollars, or just doing it on their own, going through just a private contractor to get the work done and just pay for it out of pocket. That was information that was between them and the technician. And with that said, though, I would say that a lot of farmers that we worked with really weren't too concerned about that, I would say, but we just wanted to make sure it was just kind of consistent in terms of how we handled that. But for my sake, part of the project, I wanted to document, of course, what work we got done, and so between me and the technician, that was information that we shared with each other, and that was the extent of it.
Some of the materials that Kevin and his team have produced are in your folder, in your handouts folder. And it's really interesting the approach they've taken, because they took the ACPF outputs and summarized the information for each farm. So they were really looking at it and using the information at a farm scale. And the person doing the field walkover would make a judgment call about how much of this information they would share. I mean, they had all of this information in front of them, but it was mainly for the people going out into the field, so that they were prepared to talk to the farmer and address the relevant issues. And so actually sharing the ACPF maps was not essential to sharing it with the farmers. Am I saying that right, Kevin?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we use it a lot to, like how I say, we did our homework before we went out to that farm. And so it was really to kind of build that confidence in the technician and know, yep, these are the areas I want to look at when I go out and do the walkover. And, the farmer would ask occasionally, like, well, why is this area considered a critical area or a high priority versus this area? And that's when we would pull out some of the maps to kind of just show them that, yeah, objectively, here's what, Mother Nature gave you, of course, that results in why that field is a, high risk area. But yeah, you're right, Marcel. We generally just use it as kind of more in the background for the technician to do their homework before they went out in the field. And some of them were interested in them. Some of them were more interested in just what the technician had to say in terms of what do I need to do next, and just really kind of keep it simple and keep it streamlined in that respect.
So in contrast, Joe, could you talk about how you communicated to your stakeholders, the ACPF results?
Yeah, we we were a little bit more broadly communicating the map results. In part, there is a paper that's in the folder here that was documented by some of the folks, social scientists at Purdue, and how well that went over. In general, Sarah Porter had created a fairly large size map, and we had held a few meetings where landowners kind of came to a building and they all got to gather around a table and look at the map of the watershed. And at the time maybe somebody could have been embarrassed by what they saw, but for the most part, everybody was sort of collaborating together. The landowners seemed to be genuinely interested in how their property connected to their neighbor's property. And then in particular, I think what we did is even though I was an outsider coming from Minnesota, we had folks that that knew a lot of the landowners and were able to we were able to go out, sit down on their shop table or bench and roll out the map and talk about different things. And I think what this allowed us to do was to go beyond their private property and begin to look at how their private property connected to their neighbor's private property, so that now we're getting at a small watershed scale of, well, what's going on in the riparian corridor, which then led to questions like, oh, well, if I'm already doing X, Y, and Z practices, what could we do jointly in the riparian corridor that then could overall, help reduce some of the nutrient load that's leaving the watershed? So you might say, instead of an individual farmer approach, we were really engaging these landowners to think more as a small watershed cooperative in how they could then look at the whole system, even land that they didn't have direct control over, or land that they didn't care to manage that well. They all sort of kind of came together and said, yeah, downstream we could reattach an oxbow, and that would benefit all of us. So it's a little bit different approach than what Kevin took. And it seemed to be the documentation on it by the Purdue social scientists seemed to suggest that they were okay with that.
Thanks. Sarah, how about you? What have you observed as you're communicating the results from your ACPF runs?
I can't say we've had really any privacy concerns so far. I mean, we've used the maps at like the watershed scale, some of the maps, and like the watershed plans that are publicly available. We've put some of the data up into like web apps. Otherwise, like I've mentioned before, our agronomists have, presented just like the field maps that for a particular farm, and they've been pretty receptive and haven't had really any privacy concerns that they voiced to us yet. So.
Good, thanks. And on Friday, we'll dig in more on what kind of maps can you create and what are the considerations for creating maps for all these different purposes that everyone here is talking about. Logistics. How do you pay for it? How do you find somebody that can run the ACPF? How much time does it take to run? What's just the practical side of using the ACPF? Any observations you can share with people would be appreciated.
Yeah, I'll go ahead again. So we had as I mentioned, we had a student worker. And again, we were working with some small watersheds, so we weren't talking about very big scale, but I think it took about 2 months for that student worker to process everything, prepare the maps for us so we could use those, during the walkover process. That was funded. We had some grant money, some technical assistance money available through Department of Agriculture at the time for that. So that worked pretty well. we're currently in the process of trying to figure out a way to scale some of this up at more of the kind of small sub-watershed scale, probably Huck 12 scales. And we're trying to leverage some dollars through a variety of different sources, but looking at contracting some of this work through St. Mary's University, and kind of tapping into some of their network of students that they have to do some of the BMP mapping, kind of pre-process some of these tools from the get-go. So, we're fortunate in Minnesota to have the Clean Water Fund that can help, pay for some of these things. But probably the biggest challenge is just how to coordinate with all the different groups that could utilize the information and make it easy for them to get access to.
Sarah, how about you? How many people in Outagamie County are working on this? And how much time and effort and commitment does it take?
I would say it's mostly me running this in our area. But we've had a lot of different, I think it's been mainly just like state grants for developing the 9 key element plans for these subwatersheds, so that it's helped cover the cost of running these tools.
Mm-hmm.
I would again acknowledge that at the local level, if you've got somebody like Sarah, that is great, because now you've got somebody right within that county that knows how to use the tool. That's not necessarily the case out there. In which case, as Kevin alluded to, that's where you go try to find student labor, because if you hire a professional consulting engineering firm, the cost can be prohibitive. But again, it depends on the pot of money that's available to that local unit of government. But I would say over the past decade or more, we've been able to kind of come up with students who can then work for local units of government to not only develop ACPF, but try to put together some other tools as well, which does require some coordination between the students, then working with the local government technicians to be able to sort of interpret where to go with that information.
That is really important. It's tempting to want to centralize all of this ACPF work, and it really requires a close connection to local people. As Emily was saying on Monday, the field verification is essential. There needs to be a little bit of back and forth between somebody who knows the landscape and whether the results make sense. So you can centralize to a point, but there also needs to be a strong local connection. I'm going to put Josh on the see if Josh Obrecht, if you could say a little bit about the work in Iowa. Josh is at the National ACPF Hub and has been watching and leading and working on doing runs across the whole state. And if you could just give people a sense of how much time, how much money it takes to do these runs at a watershed, county, and state scale.
Well, we've run a few out of our GS facility at Iowa State. It does take some time and commitment, and you do need to have the student labor in order to do that. Our analysts don't really have the time amongst other projects, but the fact that we can hire students to do that is very helpful to it. The biggest thing that you will run into by doing that is the training aspect of it, especially the hydro conditioning aspect of it, since for the most part you can run the tools just straight up with the default values. If your client's got the values there, then great, you can plug those in. But the hydro conditioning is going to be the key part, and that's what's going to take up the most time. And especially for us, students only working maybe at most 10 hours a week. It's going to take a long time for one person to probably get through. And then just one comment, and I will go into this more on Friday, but we are collecting results data not just for Iowa, but for any watershed that's run for outputs. And so I will show those services next week or on Friday. And so if you have some that you'll provide or would like to provide, we will gladly take them.
Thank you, Josh. So I'd like to open it up to all of you as you're listening to these people talk. What are your questions? Do you feel like you could do this, or this fits into your watersheds? What else do you need to know?
And you can type a question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask directly. So while we're waiting, Sarah, one of the things I'll ask you here is, so Outagamie County does share some area with the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. If you had any interactions or discussions with the tribe about using the tool and the data generated within the tribal boundaries.
We have partnered with them on 2 sub-watersheds that are mostly within the tribal boundaries, and have run the ACPF, and there's a 9 Kelvin plan that we've done with them. So we work pretty closely with them on a lot of projects, and they help fund some of it, the cost to us too, to assist them. So we have a pretty good working relationship with them.
So
Thanks.
Marcel, I think I got a question in the chat here if you want to read that for the panelists.
Yep. Keaton is asking, are some ACPF recommendations inapplicable to actual on-the-ground conditions, and how do you ground truth? There's a lot of angles to come at that from.
Yeah, I'll maybe chime in on that. So when we initially did the run, we found a lot of sort of false positives for, like, let's say, structural practices, especially water sediment control basins. And I think it's sort of a reflection of the topography, right? Especially in our area where we can have quite a bit of slopes. And so, I think maybe some of that's been enhanced with recent, versions that have been released. But in our initial one, that's where we got a lot of false positives, putting structures where just feasibility wise, it just would not be practical or effective at all. So, yeah, that was kind of our experience what we ran into, I guess.
Other experiences, and if somebody else in the room has experience, please speak up. Or go ahead, Joe.
Well, there's always going to be a sort of field validation component that's necessary. I mean, as Kevin pointed out, as others have pointed out, when you get out there, it's kind of like, oh, the GIS map was close, but not quite perfect. And especially when you're working with a landowner that has kind of made a decision that they're going to move forward on a practice or set of practices, you're gonna have to ratchet down now to the point where you can begin to think about design and really what are the actual on the ground characteristics that will kind of constrain what you can and can't do.
I think ground truthing means several things. I somebody who's familiar with the area can just look at a map and say, that is far too many bioreactors than we could possibly put out there. And so this needs some tweaking. This just doesn't make sense. So there's that, just looking at the map kind of verification. But then as Joe said, as you go out there and you start looking at things, see if they make sense. Chris asks, what is the estimated level of GIS skill required to run the ACPF tool? I describe it as kind of a moderate level. It's the basic ACPF skills probably aren't enough. Like if you're the kind of person who is pretty comfortable sort of formatting maps, but not much more, that's probably not enough skill. You probably need to be able to look at tables, data tables within ACPF and link them to the maps and just have some skills at analysis. But you don't need to be the high-end GIS expert in the state kind of thing. So I would say a moderate level of skills. Does that give you a sense, Chris? Yeah. Becky asks, I like the idea of using the ACPF as a lead-in to set meetings with the producers. I have not shared the map with producers because I did not want neighbors calling each other and saying we were proposing wetlands that would flood their homes. Now I know we need cut lines to take those out. Yeah. And this is really important, how you frame and present these maps. And Joe, when they were presenting these maps to the producers, they're really careful to say, this is not what we're planning to do. These are the options that are out there. And that has to be crystal clear, or you're going to really turn some people off and lose a lot of trust and legitimacy. Samikshya asks, what are some common hydroconditioning mistakes to watch out for in Tool 1 and Tool 2 to prevent issues in future steps of the ACPF process? I'm going to defer to some of the specialists that are out there. Who's still in the room right now? I guess, Sarah, would you be able to speak to that?
Trying to remember, just tool 1 is doing the like cut lines and reiterating that through. I guess one just after you kind of run through what you think it is just really verifying in those areas if it's a true depression or not, or if you're missing a cut line somewhere. Sometimes you're just gonna have to go out in the field and kind of check that. Some areas where it's like hard to tell in an air photo if a culvert or something is there that should be.
I've heard some people will either do too much cutting and others will not do enough. So there's this judgment call of finding the sweet spot. You can spend hours and hours and hours that aren't really improving the quality of your modeling. So figuring out when's enough is, I think, one challenge.
Before we go to the next question, Marcel, when it comes to culverts, some states have full inventories of every culvert in the state. Wisconsin is currently requiring all local governments to do the same. So before you put your staff in a pickup truck and start driving every mile of road, start digging into what GIS resources of culverts and bridges may be available.
And as far as the hydro conditioning is one place, but then the next place that you can make mistakes is in the flow network and differentiating the perennial and ephemeral streams and such. If you get those wrong and you present those to landowners or something, and they see you've marked something as a stream that is just a flow path through their field, that could really raise some hackles. So it's pretty important to get those right for your communication purposes. And the tools, as Emily talked about on Monday, the tools aren't going to run as well that depend on knowing where the ephemeral and perennial streams are.
Well, and I would just add to that, this is where, and I think Kevin, he had a few of those producers that he could lean into a little bit more, as we did down in Beargrass, where we'd say, "Hey, does this look correct to you? Do we really have an ephemeral or a permanent stream here?" And they could weigh in on some of that before then we'd launch the map out to a larger group of folks to look at.
Yeah. Hannah is asking, can the outputs such as runoff risk assessment be used to compare different farming practices to say these types of practices have less impact on the local watershed? I think this follows from what Kevin was talking about, that the runoff risk, if you remember, was strictly based on slope and distance from the stream. And so it doesn't consider how the land is actually being farmed. And so that land use information needs to be added to this consideration. Is that what you're getting at, Hannah? Okay. Becky, who generally has a list of bridges and culverts in the state? Would that be DOT? Boy, I bet that varies from state to state. Where are you? Oh, you're in Nebraska. Anybody know for Nebraska where to get that kind of information?
So I did respond in the chat, but if Renee Hancock or anybody else knows from Nebraska, the state DOT generally has the federal and state highways. Your county highway departments will have the county, and your town will have theirs. And so they're not all in one layer, except where states are creating one master layer. And Wisconsin is in the process of doing that.
And Ethan adds, in my experience, getting bridges and culverts isn't always easy. Ain't that the truth? Some places are willing to share the data and others don't want to. Yeah, it's some of the information sensitive.
And I'll pose the question to Ethan, and he can unmute or answer in the chat. Who are you reaching out to in your state to get that information?
Yeah, so we've reached out to DNR, DOT, local governments. It's a kind of a mix of who we have tried to get it from.
Other questions? Philip asks, is it good practice to verify that your hydro conditioning is accurate with boots on the ground before proceeding with running subsequent steps? Yeah, I would at the very least ask somebody who's been out in the field to look at it and say, does this look right? Others have comments on that one?
Yeah, you don't want to go out there and embarrass yourself. So it's good to have somebody that knows the neighborhood, that knows the terrain, that can go out and help you validate before you actually, sit down and start talking practices with a particular landowner.
Oh, here's another question that came in from somebody who's not in the Midwest. How easy is it to add other conservation practices? And Emily I guess Josh has left, but I wonder if Emily, you would be able to comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment. I think it depends on the conservation practices that are of interest and what you're trying to, what that looks like. So I think I know folks have done, I think actually we've done some work in some of our papers to highlight other practices, infield practices, primarily like cover crops or reduced till or living mulch. Um, So I mean, I think you can do that relatively easily for non-structural practices. I think, adapting things for structural practices would be more challenging.
The national team has occasionally added practices, like the saturated buffer was one that was added more recently. So it does happen, but that's kind of a bigger ask to try and add those. But if there proves to be interest in other parts of the country, they are listening, and we'll consider these.
Yeah, I guess I just add to that a little bit, Marcel. So I know two-stage ditches were recently added because of a fair bit of interest from Indiana in particular, but other states as well. And as folks who are in more arid landscapes, where we see irrigation might become more interested in the tools, I think there has been quite a bit of discussion around including basically including things like drainage water or irrigation water recycling and other systems that would reflect a more arid landscape. So if you have tools that you're interested in, I think folks, like Marcel said, I think folks' ears are open. It's just, yeah, just thinking about time and the amount of time that it takes folks like Sarah Porter to get those tools out the door.
And Ethan was also asking about the manure application estimation tool. Emily, are you able to give a quick explanation of what that is?
Oh boy, yeah. So Ethan, you might actually know more about it than I do, but Sarah Porter at she's with ARS. She does a lot of she's responsible for a huge amount of the ACPF itself and works on its enhancement and expansion. She developed this manure tool that allows folks to think more critically about the manure that's in their area, um, and where it's being applied, and perhaps where there's excess, where there's more manure than potential application opportunities. Um, Ethan, if you have other things to add, please feel welcome to unmute yourself, or if I've characterized that incorrectly.
No, I think you hit on the majority of it. It also takes into account crop rotations. Trying to think what else. So using the past year's manure in the applications. I helped her develop it when she was away from ARS, and so I've done some of the back end on it as well. But it actually takes into account residual nitrogen, NPK or NP rather, I shouldn't say, but into the application for the following year, so that you're not over applying each year. But it's a great way to estimate where and how much manure is going on to the landscape.
Thank you, Ethan. Becky says, if you add no-till cover crops, will that decrease the runoff risk output? Those infield practices will definitely reduce the risk of runoff, but it will not change the ACPF output. The ACPF output is just based on slope and distance. So if you want to account for these other factors, that needs to be accounted for separately, or yeah.
Yeah, that's where you'd want to couple with another model. Just again, if you're trying to solve a TMDL and your reductions are that, you want to bring in another model that will work in concert with ACPF.
We have another question here. How do I find other ACPF users in my state to share how we've done things? That's a really good question. I would start with that spreadsheet that's in your handouts folder, where many of you responded to that questionnaire. And if you haven't already, I'll encourage you to, you can still do that. I don't know if Kevin, if you would be able to add that link in. but get as many people onto that spreadsheet as possible. Those are the people who I would encourage you to contact. If you're having trouble, why don't you reach out to Kevin or myself or someone else at the ACPF hub? And they could help you find other people in your state to connect you with that network. Any other suggestions on that, Kevin?
Was just digging for the form. No, the ACPF hub, and because you signed up for this training, you'll be added to the newsletter list. We do try to get people together, key users, once or twice a year in a lot of the states to kind of talk about things. And so you can let Marcel or I know if you're interested in being part of that into the future. And we can definitely loop you into that.
Other questions? I am new to GIS. Is there a list of other models that can be used with ACPF in the resources that will help figure out how much we are reducing non-point source pollution? What state are you? Oh, you're in Nebraska. Let me think about that for Nebraska. I will talk more about this on Friday. And there is, what is the name of the folder that you've got there? The Watershed Planning Guides. In your handout folder, there's a folder named Watershed Planning Guides. And if you look at the one, the ACPF Wisconsin Planning, that maps out the different tools that are in Wisconsin. We haven't done them for other states. And you kind of, if somebody in your state wants to do that, we could help you format it in this way, but that's, every state is different.
Yeah, I would just ask the question, is there anybody in Nebraska that has worked with some of the hydrologic models? Typically, again, I think SWOT is probably the most commonly used across the country, but I would sort of begin there to find out, what other models are out there. But we can certainly suggest to you some models to use. I've got a postdoc and a team we're constantly comparing different models and linkages to tools here to figure out what we can come up with the best combination.
And I see Renee Hancock from Nebraska NRCS has responded when they're working with NDEE, they're using the SWOT model.
Yeah, that like I said, that's probably the most commonly used model that's being used with these tools.
We've been using the EPA STEPL model for a lot of our watersheds to calculate reductions. And then we also locally have the Wisconsin SNAP Plus model, which is more of a field-based cropping type model here.
Kevin, is it time to wrap up?
I'm not seeing any additional questions coming in. So I think that we can do two things. One is I'll ask you to kind of give, it looks like you've got the preview already up here, sort of the introduction of what we're going to be doing on Friday. And then if anybody does have questions for any of the panelists, we'll stick on for just a couple of minutes after we end here and be able to answer those. And Sarah, I see that there's a question directed for you in the chat. If you want to respond there, that would be great. So take it away, Marcel.
Yep, you are, you can use that same, I'm trying to get my chat up here, that same feedback link that you used the first time if you have further questions. So on Friday, we're going to talk about the various considerations for how to present ACPF results and kind of dig into a little bit of the nitty gritty on that, and to make sure that the way you're using it fits your goals in the watershed planning process. So it'd be really helpful for you to think through, what are your goals? How might this fit into your watershed? So before Friday, if you could look in your handouts folder, there's a document called ACPF and Watershed Capacity Assessment. Take a look at that and just think about the questions there. It's kind of a comprehensive look at, are we ready to use ACPF and do watershed scale work like this? Because it comes that assessment needs to happen at an individual level, organizational level, and a technical level. Can you use the ACPF? So take a look at that. I'll just take you a couple minutes. And we'll give you a little practice on evaluating some of the ACPF outputs, and are these the right ones, and should we be doing it this way or another way? And then we'll also spend a fair amount of time on specific states and the national ACPF activities and resources, what's going on around the country and what resources can you tap into. And that's all I have for now. Anything else, Kevin?
So we did get a question directed to Joe in the chat, and Sarah did respond, listing a couple models. So Joe, if you would take a moment to read the question from Philip there. You're muted, Joe, so you may need to unmute here.
Okay, I think you're asking about HEC-RAS as a model that you could use with ACPF. That really kind of comes back to your I guess the area you're working in. If you're simply trying to sort of route surface water, HEC-RAS will do a great job at that. If you've got a groundwater component, then HEC-RAS is not necessarily going to be a tool that will be sufficient for you. If you're trying to solve a TMDL, there's upland practices and sort of component pieces, as well as in-channel processing that goes on. This is why I think the HSPF model has been sort of commonly used across the country for solving TMDLs. But again, it really kind of comes down to where are you located, what's your terrain, what's your subsurface to surface sort of interactions, and in the end, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Who are you trying to communicate that information to? Because oftentimes our stakeholders, they don't understand the difference between an HSPF tool and a HEC-RAS.
Thank you, Joe. Well, I really want to thank Sarah and Joe and Kevin for taking some time with us today. We got through some great questions. And thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all on Friday.
Thanks again, everyone. Once again, the presenters will stick on for a moment or so here. If anybody does want to unmute and ask them a specific question. Otherwise, we are adjourned, and thank you for your time today, and we will see you on Friday. So I'm not seeing anyone with questions. So Joe, Kevin, and Sarah, thank you very much once again for being a part of today.
See you,
Yes.
everyone.
Right.
Okay, bye. Thanks, Kevin. It's always fun to sort of kind of keep the story going.